You are looking at a product in a store priced at 5,000 liras. The salesperson first shows you another model in the same category for 12,000 liras. Then they return to the original product and mention it is only 5,000 liras. The price that seemed expensive just moments ago now begins to feel perfectly reasonable. The product did not change. Your income did not change. Your need did not change either. The only thing that changed was your mind's point of comparison. You think you made the decision, but your decision might have been silently guided by a number placed in front of you just seconds ago. Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, shows that the human mind does not work as consistently, impartially, and calculatedly as we think. Our minds often produce quick answers, construct meaningful stories from incomplete information, and later find logical explanations for these stories. So when does fast thinking make our lives easier, and when does it mislead us? How does a price, a piece of news, or the fear of losing change our decisions? And even if we cannot completely eliminate our own thinking errors, what can we do to make more accurate decisions? At the center of the book are two modes of thinking. Kahneman calls them System 1 and System 2. These are not two separated physical parts inside the brain. They are conceptual characters that make it easier to understand the different ways human thought operates. System 1 operates quickly, automatically, and often effortlessly. It recognizes a familiar face. It helps you dodge an object speeding toward you. It understands the emotion behind a simple sentence. It instantly produces the answer to the question of 2 plus 2. It can often sense the anger in a person's tone of voice without making any conscious calculations. System 2, on the other hand, is the slower, more careful, and effortful mode of thinking. It steps in when you try to multiply 17 by 24 in your head. You need it when reviewing a complex contract, comparing different loan options, or calculating the possible outcomes of an important decision. System 2 directs your attention to a specific problem and can question the quick answer. In Kahneman's book, System 1 is used as the representative of fast and intuitive thinking, while System 2 represents slower and conscious thinking. This distinction is not about two independent machines in the mind, but a metaphor describing different cognitive processes. Kahneman's work on judgment and decision-making under uncertainty was recognized with the Nobel Prize in Economics in the year 2002 as he integrated psychological research with economics. System 1 is not bad and System 2 is not good. It is important to understand this distinction correctly. Without System 1, life would be incredibly slow and exhausting. You would have to think long and hard to recognize every face, read every word, make every movement, and evaluate every minor danger. An experienced driver performs many actions on an empty road without conscious calculation. A master chess player can spot a dangerous position on the board much faster than a beginner. In a field studied for a long time, intuition can turn years of pattern recognition into a reaction lasting just a few seconds. The problem is that System 1 does not only operate in areas where we are truly experts. It also quickly produces an answer in situations where information is insufficient, the outcome is uncertain, and events are random. Even if there is not enough data to generate an answer, it fills in the blanks.
The mind, which dislikes uncertainty, turns the limited pieces it has into a story instead of saying, "I do not know." When you meet someone for the first time, you might jump to a broad conclusion about their character based on a few behaviors. When you see a company's stock rising in recent months, you might assume the growth will continue. During a job interview, you might perceive a candidate's confident speech as proof of competence. These conclusions could be correct, but just as they might be right, they could also simply be a persuasive story created by fast thinking. In theory, System 2 can audit these stories. However, attention is limited. You cannot analyze every decision you make throughout the day in detail. When you are tired, in a rush, juggling multiple tasks at once, or when the issue seems unimportant to you, it is much easier to accept the quick answer. Another feature of System 2 is that, rather than generating the result itself, it often finds justifications for the answer produced by System 1. You might first feel that you dislike someone, and then look for behaviors to justify that feeling. You might first want to buy a product, and then generate reasons explaining why this purchase makes sense. We see ourselves as an impartial judge, yet sometimes we act like a lawyer who decides first and defends their decision later. One of the most powerful examples that makes this structure visible in daily life is the anchoring effect. A number you encounter before making an estimate can influence your thought process, even if it is not directly related to your answer. The initial number creates an anchor. Your mind tries to move away from this point, but most of the time it cannot pull away far enough. The first price you see in a house listing can impact the subsequent negotiations. The first salary amount discussed in a job interview can narrow the field where offers are evaluated. Seeing a high price first in a store and then the discounted price can make the second number look much more attractive. The suggested donation amount in a charity campaign can pull the figure you are willing to give up or down. The anchor does not have to be accurate. It merely needs to plant itself at the starting point of your thoughts. In classic experiments, people were first shown a random number or one weakly connected to the topic, and then asked to make an estimate about an unknown value. The estimate skewed toward the number they were shown. Subsequent research has shown that the anchoring effect can be seen across different tasks. However, the magnitude of the effect can vary depending on the context used and the research design. The dangerous part of the anchoring effect is that feeling knowledgeable does not fully protect you from it. Even if you know you are under the influence of an anchor, the first number can alter the possibilities you consider. If you enter a negotiation without researching the true value of a car, the first price stated by the seller can define your evaluation zone. While you think you are driving the price down, you might actually still be operating within the framework established by the seller. The first way to protect yourself from an anchor is to form your own estimate before seeing someone else's number. Researching the market range before heading into a salary negotiation, determining an acceptable value range for a company before making an investment, and setting a budget limit before examining a product can weaken the power of an external anchor. The second way is to think in terms of a range rather than a single figure. The question, "Is this product worth 5,000 liras?" keeps you hovering around the given price. What is the reasonable price range for similar products, and where does this product fall within that range?
This question, on the other hand, expands the field of thought. The second critical mechanism quietly managing our minds is the availability bias. When evaluating how often an event occurs or its likelihood of happening, we do not always look at statistics. More often, we look at how easily examples come to mind. Easily remembered events appear more frequent, more important, or more probable. If you have recently watched intense news coverage about an airplane crash, you might be more afraid of flying, completely independent of its actual risk. If you have seen two people around you succeed in a newly founded business, you might overestimate the success rate of entrepreneurship. If you are constantly exposed to a specific type of crime on social media, you might exaggerate its true prevalence in society. The mind takes the question, "What is the actual frequency of this event?" and replaces it with an easier question, "How many examples of this can I remember?" Tversky and Kahneman's work on availability showed that people can use the ease with which things come to mind as a mental shortcut when assessing frequency and probability. Vivid, recent, emotional, and frequently repeated examples can therefore feel much larger than their actual rates. This bias is especially important when interpreting the news, social media, and personal experiences. Events that are considered newsworthy are generally not ordinary occurrences. Rare, dramatic, and surprising developments grab more attention. But just because something appears often on your screen does not mean it happens frequently in real life. An investor might constantly see stories of rapidly rising stocks while failing to notice the silence of unsuccessful investments. A manager might completely overhaul the entire system based on the most recent mistake, simply because it is the only one they remember. A person might view an effective treatment or a valuable opportunity as far more dangerous than it really is, just because of a few bad experiences they heard about from their circle. The way to reduce the availability bias is not to trust your memory more. It is to replace memory with external data. When evaluating the frequency of an event, look at the base rates instead of counting the examples that pop into your head. Do not assume that what you have heard recently represents the entire past. Do not generalize a few experiences from your own circle to the broader society. In addition to asking, "What examples do I remember about this?" also ask, "What examples might I not be remembering?" The third crucial concept is loss aversion. The exact same amount of loss and gain does not always create an equal emotional impact on people. In most cases, the pain of losing something can be much stronger than the pleasure of gaining that exact same thing. Imagine you found 500 liras on the street. You would be happy. Now, imagine dropping 500 liras from your pocket. It is highly likely that the second event will occupy your mind far more throughout the day. This asymmetry alters decisions. An investor might hold on to a bad investment far longer than necessary just to avoid accepting the loss. An employee might fear losing the security of their current job even if they find a better opportunity. A company might continue to pour more resources into a failing project simply to avoid admitting that the time and money already invested are lost. People do not merely evaluate the future outcome. They also assess what they stand to gain and what they stand to lose relative to their current position.
Kahneman and Amos Tversky's prospect theory offered an influential model explaining that people evaluate risky choices not just by their final state of wealth, but as gains and losses relative to a reference point. This approach shows that the weight of losses on a decision can be quite different from gains of a similar magnitude. However, this tendency is not an immutable law dictating that every person will act the same way in every situation. The framing, magnitude, and context of the decision all influence the outcome. Loss aversion can also make us highly sensitive to how a decision is phrased. When told that a treatment has a 90% success rate, you might feel quite positive about it. When told that the very same treatment has a 10% failure rate, you might feel much more anxious. The mathematical information is exactly the same, but one highlights the gain while the other emphasizes the loss. For this reason, never just accept the framework presented to you when making a major decision. Flip the phrasing around. If an option is said to be 80% successful, consider the 20% chance of failure. If the benefits of a decision are being touted, write down the opportunities you will be giving up as well. If the risks of a change are being emphasized, calculate the risk of doing absolutely nothing. If you have realized by now that the initial answer your mind produces is not always impartial, you can support book analyses like this on Kitabji Adam by liking the video. The unsettling part about thinking fast and slow is this. Learning about a cognitive bias does not automatically cure you of it. You can know exactly what the anchoring effect is and still be swayed by the first price. You can recognize loss aversion and yet remain emotionally tied to a losing investment. You can learn about the availability bias and still exaggerate risks under the influence of the last news report you watched. Because these mistakes do not simply stem from a lack of knowledge, they are byproducts of the mind's normal way of functioning. Evaluating ourselves from the outside is harder than evaluating others. While we can easily spot the contradictions in someone else's decision, we can generate powerful justifications for our own.
Recognizing a bias often creates the feeling that other people behave this way. What is truly difficult is admitting that the exact same mechanism might be shaping our own thoughts right at this moment. That is why the path to making better decisions is not trying to be flawless and completely rational every single second. That is simply not possible. A more realistic method is to redesign the thinking process for important decisions. The first step is to sort decisions by their importance. You do not need to run a lengthy analysis to figure out what to eat for lunch. But decisions like changing careers, making a major investment, buying a house, hiring an employee, or signing a long-term contract deserve much slower thinking. Slowing down every decision would paralyze life. However, leaving high-stakes decisions with difficult reversals on autopilot creates unnecessary risk. The second step is to separate your first impression from your final decision. Write down your initial feeling about a person, an idea, or an investment. Then, instead of immediately accepting this feeling as the truth, treat it like a hypothesis. Instead of saying, "This person is untrustworthy," ask yourself, "I currently have a negative first impression of this person. What is the evidence supporting and refuting this?" You do not have to suppress your first impression.
You simply need to avoid confusing it with actual evidence. The third step is to adopt an outside view. Imagine you're starting a new business. Evaluating only how strong your own plan is constitutes the inside view. Researching how many similar businesses have succeeded in the past is the outside view. The inside view tells your specific story. The outside view reveals the general outcome of similar stories. When estimating how much time a project will take, do not just tally up the steps in your plan. Look at how long similar previous projects actually took. When evaluating the future of an investment, do not look solely at the company's compelling narrative. Also examine the base rates and historical outcomes of companies in that exact same sector. The fourth step is to protect independent thought. If the most senior person speaks first in a meeting, everyone else might be pulled toward their opinion. That is why for critical decisions, it can be much healthier for people to write down their opinions separately before discussing them. Form your own estimate without looking at anyone else's. Determine the value of a product to you before learning its price. Write down your own assumptions before reading an analyst's target price. An independent initial estimate will not completely rid you of bias. However, it makes it much harder for someone else's anchor to take root at the starting point of your thoughts. The fifth step is to examine the decision through two different frames. What will I gain if I make this decision? What could I lose if I make this decision? What will I gain if I do not make this decision? What could I lose if I do not make this decision? People often see only the risks of change, yet doing nothing carries a cost too. Maintaining the status quo is not a neutral choice. It is a decision that comes with its own consequences. The sixth step is to keep a decision journal. When making a major choice, write down what you know, what you expect, which assumptions you are relying on, and what risks you see. When the outcome arrives, do not just look at whether you won or lost. Analyze the quality of your decision-making process. A good decision can yield a bad outcome. A bad decision can also produce a good outcome purely through luck. If you confuse the outcome with the quality of the decision, you might mistake your lucky blunders for talent and your unfortunate correct decisions for failure. A decision journal lets you see what you actually thought in the past without altering it with hindsight. The seventh step is to seek out an opposing view. The human mind is prone to gathering evidence that supports its cherished beliefs. Because of this, do not just ask, "Why am I right?" Ask, "What information is out there that could convince me I might be wrong?" When evaluating an investment idea you love, do not just read the most optimistic analysis. Make sure to read a strong opposing viewpoint as well. When hiring an employee, evaluate not only their good traits, but also the conditions that might cause them to fail in the role. Before launching a project,
Sit down with the team and think about all the reasons why it could fail. The goal is not to become paralyzed by doubting every single idea. It is to put your idea through a genuine stress test. The strongest aspect of thinking fast and slow is that it does not declare humanity foolish or irrational. It demonstrates that the mind is an incredibly effective, yet remarkably limited system. Thanks to fast thinking, we navigate the world fluidly. But because of that very same speed, we sometimes draw overly confident conclusions from incomplete data. The book's weak point, however, is that not all of its chapters hold up with the same robustness. In the years that followed, issues of reproducibility were debated within certain research areas of psychology.
For this reason, it is not entirely correct to view every experimental example detailed in the book as an immutable and universal human law. System 1 and System 2 are not an exact map of the brain either, but rather an explanatory model that organizes modes of thinking. Despite this, the core contribution of the book remains profound. The research tradition showing that people do not make decisions under uncertainty like flawless calculators, and that estimates can be deeply swayed by mental shortcuts and the way information is presented, has created a massive impact across psychology, economics, medicine, law, management, and public policy. The single most incorrect conclusion to draw from the book is the idea that you should never trust your intuition. Intuition can be extraordinarily valuable in domains where regular patterns exist and you receive long-term, reliable feedback. An experienced firefighter, doctor, athlete, or chess player can learn to quickly recognize genuine cues over years of practice. But if the environment is highly random, if feedback is delayed, or if success relies heavily on sheer luck, then highly confident intuition may simply be unreliable. A feeling of confidence is not proof of accuracy. The right question is not, should I trust my intuition? The right question is this: was the environment where this intuition developed suitable for genuine learning? Have I practiced enough repetitions? Did I receive regular and accurate feedback about my mistakes? Now, let us turn all these ideas into a concise decision-making method you can use starting today. When faced with an important choice, write down your very first answer, but do not act on it immediately. Next, identify the very first number presented to you. That number could be a price, a target, a historical value, or someone else's estimate. Form your own independent range. Then, consult base rates instead of relying on your memory. Do not assume that the striking examples that pop into your head represent the whole truth. Rewrite the decision in the language of both gain and loss. Evaluate the risk of changing right alongside the risk of not changing at all. Finally, determine exactly what piece of information would change your mind beforehand. If absolutely no evidence can alter your choice, you might not be analyzing anything. You might just be defending your existing belief. This method will not eliminate every single error, but it vastly increases the odds that you will run the answer produced by fast thinking through a much more careful evaluation. Let us return to the store example from the beginning. The 5,000 lira product might actually be perfect for you. Perhaps its price is perfectly reasonable as well. The problem is not that you bought the product. The problem is that you misunderstood exactly why you bought it. You might think you made the decision based purely on your need, your budget, and your alternatives. Meanwhile, that initial 12,000 lira price tag might have quietly set the stage in your mind without you ever realizing it. That is the single most important lesson left by thinking fast and slow. The fact that your mind produces quick answers is not a flaw. It is a massive evolutionary advantage that allows you to survive, learn, and navigate your daily life. But just because a thought feels incredibly fast, fluent, and convincing does not mean it is actually right.
What do you think influences your choices the most? The first numbers you see? The paralyzing fear of losing? Or the dramatic examples you have recently heard? You can share your answer down in the comments. If you want to discover not just the core ideas of books, but their strengths, their limits, and how you can practically apply them in everyday life, you can subscribe to Kitapchiatum, because sometimes, to think better, you do not need more information. You simply need to realize how your own mind is altering the information you already have.